The downpour pounded the streets as Sarah raced through the rain, desperate to make it home before the HOA enforcers arrived. The ominous black SUV turning the corner sent a chill down her spine. They were already on her trail. Sarah gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, as she made a sharp turn down an alley, praying she could lose them in the maze of rain-soaked backroads. But the relentless flashing lights in her rearview mirror told a different story. They were closing in, and Sarah knew her time was running out. Panic surged through her as she thought of the consequences: hefty fines, a lion on her home, even potential jail time. All because she had dared to defy the all-powerful Homeowners Association. Asterisk, it started with a simple tree, asterisk, she thought, her mind racing. The towering oak in her front yard, a testament to the neighborhood's natural beauty. But to the HOA, it was an eyesore, blocking the pristine views of their manicured lawns and conformist landscaping. Sarah had fought them tooth and nail, citing the tree's historical significance and the habitat it provided for local wildlife. But the HOA, led by the tyrannical Mrs. Wilkins, was unmoved. It must be removed, she had declared in that icy, authoritative tone. It's in clear violation of our community guidelines. When Sarah refused, the HOA retaliated with a barrage of threats and intimidation tactics. Fines, warning letters, and even a lawsuit, all designed to break her spirit and force her to comply. But Sarah was no pushover. She knew the HOA's rules inside and out, and she was determined to use their own system against them. And so, in a daring act of defiance, Sarah had taken matters into her own hands. Under the cover of night, she had carefully rigged the tree with strategically placed ropes and pulleys, ensuring that when the chainsaws came, the tree would fall directly into the living room of Mrs. Wilkins' pristine $1 million home. Asterisk, now they're coming for me, asterisk, Sarah thought, her heart pounding. She could see the HOA enforcer's SUV gaining ground, its menacing headlights piercing the darkness. Gritting her teeth, she pushed the pedal to the floor, determined to outrun the impending consequences of her bold move. The rain-slicked roads made it a perilous journey, but Sarah's adrenaline-fueled driving skills were no match for the HOA's goons. She weaved through the streets, taking sharp turns and narrow alleys, putting as much distance between them as possible. Finally, she pulled into her driveway, the garage door closing behind her just as the black SUV came into view. Sarah sat in the car, her heart pounding, knowing that the showdown with the HOA was far from over. But for now, she had escaped their clutches, and that was a victory in itself. As the rain continued to fall, Sarah steeled herself for the inevitable confrontation to come. The battle lines had been drawn, and she was prepared to fight tooth and nail to protect her home, her tree, and her way of life. This was no longer just about a simple landscaping dispute. It had become a high-stakes power struggle, with Sarah as the lone homeowner, standing up to the corrupt and overbearing Homeowners Association. The stage was set for a showdown that would shake the very foundations of the neighborhood. The next morning, Sarah awoke to the sound of sirens and the rumble of heavy machinery outside her home. Peering through the blinds, she saw a tangle of police cars, fire trucks, and news vans crowding the street in front of her house. Her heart raced as she realized the HOA had finally made their move. Steeling herself, Sarah stepped outside, determined to face the music. As soon as she emerged, a swarm of reporters descended, shoving microphones in her face and bombarding her with questions. Mrs. Wilkins, the HOA president, is claiming you deliberately sabotaged the tree in your front yard, causing it to crash into her home, one reporter shouted. How do you respond to these allegations? Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing. The tree was perfectly healthy, and I did everything in my power to protect it. The HOA's relentless campaign of harassment and intimidation left me with no choice but to take drastic action. The reporters scribbled furiously, their cameras flashing as Sarah continued. Mrs. Wilkins and her cronies have been abusing their power for years, trampling on the rights of homeowners in this community. This was a desperate act of last resort to stand up to their tyranny. Just then, a familiar black SUV pulled up, and Sarah tensed as the imposing figure of Mrs. Wilkins emerged, her perfectly coiffed hair and designer suit a stark contrast to the chaos around her. The HOA president strode up to the microphones, her icy gaze fixed on Sarah. "This woman is a criminal, plain and simple," Mrs. Wilkins declared, her voice dripping with disdain. "She has committed an act of wanton destruction, causing thousands of dollars in damage to my home. We will be pursuing the maximum legal penalties, and she will be made an example of to the rest of this community." Sarah stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "You've been trying to bully me into compliance for months, Mrs. Wilkins. Your so-called community guidelines are nothing more than a web of oppressive rules designed to line your own pockets. Well, I'm not backing down this time." The reporters erupted in a cacophony of questions, but Sarah raised her hand, silencing them. "I have evidence of the HOA's corruption, their illegal use of funds, and their attempts to intimidate and silence homeowners. If you think I'm going down without a fight, you're sorely mistaken." Mrs. Wilkins' face contorted with rage, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the palms of her hands. "You'll regret the day you crossed me, Sarah. The full force of the law will come down on you, and you'll be begging for mercy before this is over." With that, she stormed back to her car, her entourage of HOA enforcers trailing behind her. Sarah watched as they peeled out, tires squealing on the wet pavement. She knew the battle had only just begun, but she was more determined than ever to expose the corruption at the heart of the Homeowners Association. As the reporters continued to shout questions, Sarah held up her hand, silencing them once more. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice calm and resolute. "The truth will come out, and the people of this community will see the HOA for what it truly is, a corrupt, power-hungry entity that must be stopped." With that, she turned and headed back into her home, the sounds of the chaos outside fading as she closed the door behind her. Sarah knew that the road ahead would be long and arduous, but she was ready to take on the might of the HOA, no matter the cost. Asterisk, the game is on, asterisk, she thought, a steely determination burning in her eyes. Asterisk and, "I'm not going down without a fight," asterisk. The following days were a blur of activity as Sarah scrambled to gather her evidence and build her case against the HOA. She pored over stacks of documents, meticulously piecing together a damning trail of corruption, embezzlement, and abuse of power. Meanwhile, the media frenzy surrounding the tree incident showed no signs of slowing down. Sarah's defiant stand against the HOA had struck a chord with the public, and she found herself the subject of countless news reports, talk show interviews, and social media discussions. But Sarah knew that the true battle lay in the courtroom, where she would have to go toe-to-toe with the HOA's high-powered legal team. She needed a strategy that would not only expose the association's misdeeds, but also protect her from their retaliatory efforts. That's when she stumbled upon a crucial piece of information, a little-known clause in the community bylaws that granted homeowners the right to challenge HOA decisions through a binding arbitration process. It was a long shot, but Sarah was determined to give it a try. With her evidence meticulously organized and her legal strategy mapped out, Sarah strode into the arbitration hearing, ready to take on the HOA's formidable contingent of lawyers and enforcers. As the proceedings began, she laid out her case with unwavering confidence, detailing the association's pattern of misconduct and the ways in which they had violated her rights as a homeowner. The HOA's lawyers, led by the icy Mrs. Wilkins, fought back with equal tenacity, attempting to discredit Sarah's evidence and paint her as a disgruntled troublemaker. But Sarah remained unfazed, calmly refuting their arguments and pressing on with her damning revelations. As the hearing dragged on, the tension in the room became palpable. The arbitrator, a stern-faced retired judge, listened intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. Sarah could feel the weight of her case resting on his decision, and she knew that this was her best, and perhaps only, chance to take down the HOA juggernaut. Finally, after hours of deliberation, the arbitrator delivered his verdict. Based on the evidence presented, I find that the Homeowners Association has engaged in a pattern of unethical and illegal practices, including the misappropriation of funds, the abuse of power, and the violation of homeowners' rights. A hush fell over the room as the arbitrator continued, his gaze fixed on the stunned HOA representatives. Furthermore, I find that the association's actions against Mrs. Sarah Cooper were not only unjustified, but also retaliatory in nature. As such, I am ordering the immediate reversal of all fines and penalties levied against her, as well as the restoration of her property and the removal of any liens or legal actions against her home. Sarah felt a surge of triumph as the HOA lawyers erupted in outraged protests, their faces twisted with fury. Mrs. Wilkins, in particular, seemed on the verge of meltdown, her carefully crafted veneer of composure crumbling before Sarah's eyes. "This is an outrage," the HOA president shrieked, her voice cutting through the din. "You have no right to interfere with the way we run our community. We will appeal this decision, and we will make sure that Sarah Cooper pays dearly for her actions." But the arbitrator raised a hand, silencing her. "Your threats and intimidation tactics will no longer work, Mrs. Wilkins. The homeowners of this community have spoken, and they have made it clear that they will no longer tolerate your abuse of power. This decision is final, and any further attempts to retaliate against Mrs. Cooper will be met with the full force of the law." As the HOA representatives stormed out of the room, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had won the first round, but she knew that the war was far from over. The HOA would not go down without a fight, and she would have to remain vigilant, ready to defend her home and her community from their relentless onslaught. Asterisk, this is just the beginning, asterisk, she thought, a steely determination burning in her eyes. Asterisk, the battle lines have been drawn, and I'm not going anywhere, asterisk. The arbitrator's scathing ruling against the HOA had been a major victory for Sarah, but she knew that the war was far from over. The association's leaders, led by the vindictive Mrs. Wilkins, were not the type to take defeat lying down. Sure enough, the very next day, Sarah awoke to the sound of a commotion outside her home. Peering through the window, she saw a small army of HOA enforcers and contractors swarming her property, their faces set with grim determination. Rushing outside, Sarah confronted the intruders, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "What is the meaning of this? This is my private property, and you have no right to be here." One of the enforcers, a burly man with a menacing glare, stepped forward. "We're here on orders from the Homeowners Association to conduct emergency repairs on your home. Violations have been issued, and you have 24 hours to comply or face further legal action." Sarah's heart sank as she realized the HOA's retaliation had begun. "This is outrageous." The arbitrator's ruling was clear. "You have no grounds to take any action against me or my property." But the enforcer remained unmoved, his expression hardening. "The ruling only applies to the tree incident. We've identified several other violations that need to be addressed immediately. You can either cooperate, or will be forced to take more drastic measures." Gritting her teeth, Sarah knew she had no choice but to acquiesce, at least for the moment. She watched helplessly as the HOA contractors swarmed her home, ripping up her carefully tended garden, trimming her trees to their exacting standards, and even replacing the siding on her house without her consent. As the work progressed, Sarah's anger only grew, but she dared not interfere, knowing that the HOA was just waiting for her to make a wrong move. The enforcers, with their constant surveillance and intimidating presence, made it clear that any resistance would be met with swift and severe consequences. Finally, as the sun began to set, the work was complete, and the HOA contingent departed, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts. She knew that this was just the beginning. The HOA was not going to let her off the hook so easily. That night, As she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, a plan began to form in Sarah's mind. She would need to be even more strategic, more cunning, if she was going to outmaneuver the HOA's relentless campaign of harassment and intimidation. The next morning, Sarah set to work, meticulously combing through the community bylaws and local ordinances, searching for any loopholes or technicalities she could exploit. She knew that the HOA's actions, while underhanded, were still bound by the rules and regulations they claimed to uphold. As she delved deeper into the legal minutiae, Sarah began to uncover a web of contradictions and inconsistencies within the HOA's own guidelines. It was clear that the association had been bending the rules to suit their own agenda, and Sarah was determined to turn that against them. With a renewed sense of purpose, Sarah reached out to a local legal aid organization, enlisting their help in building her case. Together, they pored over the evidence, crafting a strategy that would not only defend her home and property, but also expose the HOA's corruption and abuse of power. Asterisk, this is a fight I can't afford to lose, asterisk, Sarah thought, her eyes narrowing with determination. Asterisk, the future of this entire community is at stake, and I'll be damned if I let the HOA win, asterisk. As the sun set on another day, Sarah knew that the stage was set for an epic showdown, one that would test the limits of her resolve and her legal acumen. But she was ready, more determined than ever, to take down the tyrannical Homeowners Association, no matter the cost. The legal battle with the HOA had become a relentless game of cat and mouse, with Sarah and her team of lawyers constantly staying one step ahead of the association's ruthless tactics. Every time the HOA tried to hit her with a new violation or penalty, Sarah would counter with a clever legal maneuver, exploiting the very loopholes and inconsistencies she had uncovered in their own bylaws. But the HOA was not about to give up without a fight. Determined to break Sarah's resolve, they escalated their campaign of harassment, sending a constant stream of enforcers to her home, issuing fines for the most trivial of infractions, and even attempting to place a line on her property. Through it all, Sarah remained steadfast, her unwavering determination fueling her every move. She knew that the future of her community was at stake, and she was willing to do whatever it took to ensure that the HOA's reign of terror came to an end. One day, as Sarah was poring over the latest legal documents, her phone rang. On the other end was a voice she had come to dread. Mrs. Wilkins, the HOA president. Mrs. Cooper, the woman's icy tone sent a chill down Sarah's spine. I've been informed that you've been in contact with the local news media, attempting to paint the Homeowners Association in a negative light. Sarah straightened her posture, her voice calm and resolute. I'm simply trying to expose the truth, Mrs. Wilkins. The community deserves to know about the corruption and abuse of power within the HOA. That's where you're mistaken, my dear, Mrs. Wilkins replied, a hint of malice creeping into her tone. The community is perfectly content with the way we run things. It's only a few troublemakers like you who are causing problems. Sarah felt her blood boil, but she kept her composure. The arbitrator's ruling was clear. The HOA has been violating the rights of homeowners, and I'm not going to stop until that changes. Oh, but you see, that's where you're wrong, Mrs. Wilkins purred. The arbitrator's ruling only applied to the tree incident. We've since identified numerous other violations on your property, and we're prepared to take the necessary legal action to ensure compliance. Sarah's heart raced as she realized the extent of the HOA's machinations. You're going to keep coming after me, aren't you? No matter what I do, you'll find a way to punish me and my family. Precisely, Mrs. Wilkins replied, her voice dripping with triumph. You're a thorn in our side, Mrs. Cooper, and we're not going to rest until you've been dealt with. So I'd suggest you start packing your bags because you're about to lose everything. With that, the line went dead, leaving Sarah in a state of stunned disbelief. She knew that the HOA was playing for keeps, and that they would stop at nothing to break her. But she also knew that she couldn't back down. not when the entire community was counting on her to stand up to the association's tyranny. Steeling herself, Sarah turned her attention back to the legal documents, her mind racing with a new strategy. If the HOA was going to keep throwing violations and penalties at her, then she would have to find a way to turn the tables, to use their own rules and regulations against them. As she delved deeper into the community bylaws, a plan began to take shape in her mind. It was a risky gambit, but if she played her cards right, she just might be able to bring the HOA down from the inside. Asterisk, this is my last chance, asterisk, Sarah thought, her eyes narrowing with determination. Asterisk, can't afford to lose this fight, not when so much is at stake, asterisk. With renewed vigor, she set to work, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she prepared to unleash her most daring legal maneuver yet. The future of her community hung in the balance, and Sarah was determined to come out on top, no matter the cost. The grand ballroom of the community center was packed to the brim, a sea of anxious faces as the homeowners of the neighborhood gathered for the crucial HOA meeting. Tensions were high, the air thick with a palpable sense of unease, as everyone waited with bated breath for the proceedings to begin. At the front of the room, Sarah stood resolute, her gaze unwavering as she surveyed the crowd. She had spent countless hours poring over the HOA's bylaws, meticulously crafting a legal strategy that she hoped would finally put an end to the association's reign of terror. As the meeting commenced, Mrs. Wilkins, the HOA president, took the stage, her icy demeanor belying the underlying tension that hung in the air. She began by outlining a series of proposed community improvements, her words dripping with false benevolence. But Sarah was ready, her hand shooting up as soon as the president finished speaking. "Excuse me, Mrs. Wilkins, but I'd like to challenge the legality of these improvements you're proposing." The crowd erupted in murmurs, and Mrs. Wilkins' expression darkened. "What are you talking about, Mrs. Cooper?" she asked, her voice laced with disdain. Sarah stepped forward, her voice clear and confident. According to Section 7, Subsection 4 of the HOA bylaws, any proposed changes to the community's infrastructure or landscaping must be approved by a 2/3 majority of homeowners. Yet, as I've reviewed the association's financial records, it's clear that these improvements are being funded entirely by HOA funds, without the consent of the community. The crowd erupted in a mix of cheers and shocked gasps, and Mrs. Wilkins' face turned a deep shade of crimson. "That's preposterous," she sputtered, her composure slipping. "The HOA has the authority to make these decisions on behalf of the community." "Actually, Mrs. Wilkins," Sarah interrupted, Section 3, Subsection 2 clearly states that the HOA is prohibited from using association funds for any purpose that does not directly benefit the entire community. These improvements seem to be little more than a thinly veiled attempt to line your own pockets. The crowd erupted in outrage, and Sarah could see the panic in Mrs. Wilkins' eyes. The HOA president tried to regain control of the situation, but Sarah pressed on, citing one bylaw violation after another, each one eliciting a stronger reaction from the homeowners. Furthermore, Sarah continued, "I've uncovered evidence of the HOA's repeated harassment and intimidation tactics against homeowners who dare to challenge your authority. This includes the imposition of illegal fines, the placement of liens on properties, and even the use of threats and coercion." As Sarah laid out her case, the crowd's anger only grew, and she could see the HOA representatives squirming in their seats. Finally, Mrs. Wilkins, her composure shattered, raised her hand in a desperate attempt to silence the crowd. "Enough of this nonsense," she shouted, her voice shrill and panicked. "I will not stand here and be accused of such outrageous claims. This meeting is adjourned, and anyone who continues to disrupt the HOA's operations will face severe consequences." But the crowd refused to be silenced, their voices rising in a chorus of outrage and demands for accountability. Sarah stood tall, her gaze unwavering, as she watched the HOA's carefully constructed facade crumble before her eyes. Asterisk, this is it. Asterisk, she thought, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. Asterisk, the beginning of the end for the Homeowners Association's reign of terror asterisk. As the meeting dissolved into chaos, Sarah knew that the tides had turned. The community had finally found its voice, and with her at the helm, they were ready to take down the corrupt HOA once and for all. The aftermath of the explosive HOA meeting was nothing short of pandemonium. As the homeowners poured out of the community center, their faces alight with a newfound sense of empowerment, Sarah found herself at the center of a media frenzy. Reporters swarmed her, shoving microphones in her face and bombarding her with questions. "Mrs. Cooper, how does it feel to have taken down the most powerful HOA in the state?" one journalist asked, her eyes shining with excitement. Sarah took a deep breath, her expression calm and composed. "This isn't about me. It's about the community standing up to the corruption and abuse of power that has been going on for far too long. The Homeowners Association has preyed on the fears and insecurities of homeowners for years, but today the people have spoken, and they've made it clear that they're no longer willing to tolerate it." As the reporters continued to press her for more details, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and accomplishment. She had fought tooth and nail against the HOA's relentless campaign of harassment and intimidation, and against all odds, she had emerged victorious. But her triumph was short-lived, for as she turned to leave, she caught sight of a familiar black SUV pulling up to the curb. Her heart raced as Mrs. Wilkins, the HOA president, stepped out, her icy gaze fixed on Sarah. "You think you've won, don't you, Mrs. Cooper?" The woman spat, her voice dripping with venom. "But this is far from over. The Homeowners Association will not be brought down so easily." Sarah steeled herself, unwilling to back down in the face of the HOA's threats. "The community has spoken, Mrs. Wilkins. Your days of abusing your power and manipulating the people are over. We're not going to let you get away with it anymore." Mrs. Wilkins let out a harsh laugh, her eyes narrowing. "Oh, but you're mistaken, my dear. We have ways of dealing with troublemakers like you. Ways that don't involve the prying eyes of the media or the pesky constraints of the law." The threat hung in the air, and Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that the HOA was not about to go down without a fight, and that they would stop at nothing to maintain their grip on the community. As the SUV peeled away, Sarah turned to the reporters, her expression grim. "This is far from over," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "The Homeowners Association has made it clear that they're willing to resort to underhanded tactics to preserve their power. But we're not going to back down, not when the future of our community is at stake." The reporters listened with rapt attention, their pens flying across their notepads as Sarah laid out her plans for the next phase of the battle. She would need to rally the community to build a coalition of homeowners who were willing to stand up to the HOA's intimidation tactics. It would be a long and arduous fight, but Sarah was more determined than ever to see it through. She knew that the stakes were high, and that the fate of the entire neighborhood hung in the balance. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the community center, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. The HOA might have drawn first blood, but she was far from beaten. With the support of her neighbors, she was ready to take the fight to the HOA, and this time she was determined to win. Asterisk, no more intimidation tactics, no more threats, asterisk, she thought, her eyes narrowing with determination. Asterisk, this is our community, and we're not going to let the HOA destroy it, asterisk. The tension in the air was palpable as Sarah stood before the gathered crowd of homeowners, her eyes scanning the faces of her neighbors with a mixture of determination and trepidation. After the explosive HOA meeting, the community was in a state of uneasy truce, with the residents waiting with bated breath for the next move from the powerful Homeowners Association. Sarah knew that the battle was far from over. Mrs. Wilkins and her cronies had made it clear that they were willing to resort to any means necessary to maintain their grip on the community, and she had no doubt that they were already plotting their next move. "My friends," Sarah began, her voice projecting a calm confidence that belied the turmoil churning within her. "We have taken the first step in reclaiming our community from the clutches of the HOA, but we cannot rest on our laurels. The fight is far from over, and we must be vigilant and prepared for the challenges that lie ahead." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Sarah felt a surge of hope. She knew that the people were ready to stand up and fight, but she also knew that they would need to be strategic and unified if they were to have any chance of defeating the formidable HOA machine. "We must be prepared for the HOA's retaliatory actions," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the assembly. "They will not go down without a fight, and we must be ready to meet their challenges head-on." Sarah outlined her plan, laying out a comprehensive strategy that involved mobilizing the community, gathering evidence of the HOA's misdeeds, and exploring legal avenues to hold the association accountable. The homeowners listened intently, their faces set with a resolute determination. As the meeting drew to a close, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that the road ahead would be long and arduous, but she was more determined than ever to see this fight through to the end. In the days that followed, the community sprang into action, with homeowners volunteering their time and resources to support Sarah's efforts. They scoured through the HOA's records, uncovering a web of financial irregularities and abuses of power that they knew would be the key to their ultimate victory. Meanwhile, Mrs. Wilkins and the HOA leadership were not idle. They unleashed a relentless campaign of intimidation and retribution, targeting homeowners who dared to defy their authority. Fines and penalties rained down upon the community, and even the threat of legal action loomed large. But the residents of the neighborhood refused to be cowed. They banded together, supporting one another and standing firm in the face of the HOA's attacks. Sarah, at the forefront of the movement, continued to rally the troops, her unwavering determination fueling the community's resolve. Finally, the moment of reckoning arrived. With a mountain of evidence in hand, Sarah and her team of lawyers marched into the courthouse, ready to take on the HOA's formidable legal team. The battle was fierce, with both sides fighting tooth and nail for their respective causes. But as the proceedings wore on, it became increasingly clear that the HOA's tactics were no match for the community's united front. In the end, the judge's ruling was unequivocal. The HOA was found guilty of widespread financial mismanagement, abuse of power, and violations of homeowners' rights. The association was ordered to disband, and their assets were to be distributed to the community as restitution. As the gavel fell, a cheer went up from the assembled crowd, and Sarah felt a surge of triumph coursing through her veins. The community had won, and the tyrannical reign of the Homeowners Association had come to a dramatic and resounding end. As the homeowners embraced one another, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and relief. They had faced seemingly insurmountable odds, but through their unity, determination, and unwavering commitment to justice, they had emerged victorious. The future of the community was now in their own hands, and Sarah knew that they were ready to forge a new path, one free from the oppressive grip of the HOA.